that I also observed that we've had quite a time of it in the last half hour. I'm here at the YWCA in Canberra, and for the first time ever, of course, the YWCA's internet has gone down today, so we are bringing this meeting to you on a series of dongles and hotspots from various phones. So if a technical difficulty emerges, we have got a few workarounds in mind. Around the country in the last few years, we have shown what our sector can do. We've put people into hotels with each lockdown. We've worked so hard to try not to put people back into homelessness at the end of each lockdown. We have inspired state and territory governments to do more, and more they did. And after almost a decade without support from the federal government, this year we enter Homelessness Week with a government that does have relevant commitments to develop a national housing and homelessness plan and to provide 20,000 social houses around the country over its first term. And so today we are delighted to formally begin the conversation with our federal government about what should be in that plan to end homelessness. And with Homelessness Week, we are launching Homelessness Australia's position paper in relation to that, to the plan. And that plan's got 4 key pillars: ending rent stress, ending homelessness for women and children and young people, ending Aboriginal homelessness, and ending repeat homelessness. And hopefully you've all received that plan this morning in your email. Now, I'm hoping Mr. Collins is here with us. Julie, I'm just wondering if you can confirm that you're there. Not quite yet. The Minister is in Parliament.
I should be here now. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we've got you. Fantastic. I really didn't want to go into introducing you unless you've been able to drag yourself away from the house. But so it is great. It's just great to have our new Minister with us today, our new Minister for Homelessness, Julie Collins MP. Julie was elected as the first female representative for Franklin in 2007. She believes deeply in quality education, decent health services, and that fairness in the workplace should be available to everyone. And our new Minister has had a persistent focus on improving the lives of others throughout her parliamentary career. Minister Collins was our Minister briefly before the change of government in 2013, and we're just so delighted to have her back and here with us today to launch Homelessness Week and begin that dialogue that we must have about what is needed in that plan to end homelessness. So big welcome, Minister Collins, and over to you.
Thanks, Denny, and can I say I'm sorry I'm not there actually physically in person, but parliamentary duties preventing me from that today. I too want to begin by acknowledging traditional owners right across the lands from which we're meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also, of course, want to thank you and Homelessness Australia for the opportunity to be able to speak to you all today. As you outlined, today marks the beginning of Homelessness Week in 2022, and it's a very important week that brings to the fore the challenges faced by far too many Australians. We all know that access to safe, affordable and sustainable housing can have a profound impact on a person, improving their social, their health, their employment and their education outcomes. We also know that homelessness can take many forms, whether it's sleeping rough, couch surfing or even living in a car or in a tent. We also know that homelessness has far too many faces. According to the 2016 census, around 116,000 people were experiencing homelessness in Australia at that time. And whilst we're expecting the results of the 2021 census in 2023, I can't say I'm really looking forward to it because I expect sadly that these numbers will have increased. But the results are very important as they will help the Commonwealth and the state governments better understand the nature and the occurrence of homelessness in Australia.
Mr. Collins,
Jenny outlined, Australia's Homelessness Week themes in homelessness, we need a plan. The Albanese government recognises homelessness is a significant issue and is committed to working with the states, territories and stakeholders across both the housing and the social services sector to tackle this national issue. We all know that good leadership starts from the top, and the Prime Minister's deep personal connection to this issue really means that Australia finally has a government in Canberra that will step up and show strong leadership and a focus on ensuring that more Australians can have a safe place to call home. It's also one of the reasons the portfolios of housing and homelessness have once again been put back into Cabinet. I've also been very clear about my commitment. I want to work closely with states, territories, local government and with the sector to address the housing and homelessness challenges that Australia faces. I've already started work on this. I chaired the first Housing Ministers meeting in almost 5 years last month as a first step in designing and developing our housing reform agenda to address these significant challenges right across the housing spectrum, from homelessness to housing affordability. One of the key pillars in the Albanese Government Housing and Reform Agenda, as you heard from Jenny, is the development of a National Housing and Homelessness Plan. With that plan, we want to establish, it will be informed by advice provided by the new National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, and it will set out key short-term, medium and long-term reforms needed to improve housing and homelessness outcomes. And states and territory ministers were very enthusiastic when I met with them last month and are all very committed to trying to head in the same direction to try and solve some of these issues. Additionally, we're also increasing the level of social and affordable housing with our $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund, which will build 30,000 social and affordable houses within the first 5 years of the fund. The initial returns from this fund will focus on several at-risk groups. The fund will provide $200 million for the repair, maintenance and improvements in housing in remote Indigenous communities, and also recognising that domestic and family violence is the leading cause of homelessness for women. The fund will fund $100 million for crisis and transitional housing options for women and children fleeing domestic and family violence, and will also focus on older women on low incomes who are at risk of homelessness. $30 million from the fund will also build more housing and specialist support services for veterans who are at risk of homelessness. We recognise the complex interactions between different segments of the housing system. The Albanese Government's housing reform agenda also includes initiatives to respond to declining housing affordability and to help get more people into the housing market. This includes the new Help to Build shared equity scheme that will make it easier for 100,000 eligible Australians each year to own their own home. We'll also have the help regional Australians through the Regional First Home Buyer Support Scheme, which will provide up to 10,000 guarantees each financial year to first home buyers in regional Australia. The Albanese Government's housing reform agenda will improve outcomes right across the spectrum, including making it easier for Australians to buy a home, easier to rent, and to put a roof over the head of more Australians who are currently experiencing homelessness. Ultimately, the ambition of our government, and for me as Minister for Housing and Homelessness, is to match the effort, the expertise and the energy of all of you. I really want to acknowledge all of your work, for some of you over many years, and the incredible people, particularly who are on the front line of this work. Whether it's delivering more social housing, supporting organisations providing crisis accommodation, or dealing directly with those Australians at risk or experiencing homelessness. And acknowledging that work, I want to say thank you on behalf of the government for everything you do, and extend that thanks from the Prime Minister down across the government. As I've said, we're genuine about stepping up. We want to address this issue, we want to show leadership, but it's only by working together that we'll actually achieve real change. So I look forward to working with all of you. Homelessness in Australia in 2022 is at a critical point for various reasons, but we're all dedicated within the new government to working and putting in that work. As I've briefly outlined to you today, we do intend to tackle the issue, and we look forward to working with states, territories and with the sector to make a valuable difference to the lives of many Australians. For now, I'm really pleased to launch Homelessness Week 2022, and I look forward to working with you, as I've said, on numerous occasions to positively change lives for so many across the country. Thanks for having me.
Many thanks, Minister. It's so good to have you here with us today, and thank you for your strong work to date, even in your first few weeks in the role. And we really look forward to working with you to develop this, to develop a stellar national plan to end homelessness.
Thank you. The enthusiasm from the states, the territories and from the sector to date has been enormous. My office has been dealing with various people with COVID in the last few weeks and months. So we hope to have everybody back on deck, and in the meantime, we're obviously trying to chew gum and walk at the same time.
Thank you, Minister. And just to let everybody know, the Minister will be back with us next week to open our national conference. And for those of you that haven't booked in yet, it's not too late to register to attend online, and you'll hear it greater in a more fulsome leaf from Minister Collins in opening that event.
and to catching up with you all in person next week. Take care in the meantime. Let's hope that Homelessness Week this week is fruitful and that we all get some outcomes at the end of it and some commitments to moving forward.
Thank you, Minister. Really appreciate it. And so now we'll move straight on to our panel discussion. And, you know, as we've already, Minister Collins has mentioned, we do have this great opportunity with a government that is committed to our housing and homelessness plan. And so for the rest of this forum, we're going to turn our minds to what do we need to include for a plan to end homelessness. And we would see at Homelessness Australia this as a kickstart to the dialogue that is needed about what needs to be in that plan. You know, today we have released the start of a plan that sets out the key elements of the 4 pillars that I mentioned earlier. And what we're going to do in this forum is work our way through those 4 elements. But of course, we know there's a great deal more than these base elements needed to end homelessness, and we're really seeing this as a starting point for our dialogue as we engage with government over the next year or so to expand what is in the plan. So today you're going to hear from some experts, and we're also going to have the opportunity to hear from you as the audience if things continue to go to time. So on that panel, we have right behind me, I'm in her office, Frances Crimmins, who's the CEO of the YWCA in Canberra, who's going to speak about ending homelessness for women and children. Online, we have Dr. Catherine Robinson, who's the Associate Professor in Housing and Communities at the University of Tasmania, who will be speaking about ending homelessness for unaccompanied children and young people. I think highlighted for us all at the moment is Darren Smith, who's the CEO of Aboriginal Housing Victoria, who's going to speak about ending Aboriginal homelessness. We have Jane Barnes, who's the Chief of Staff at Wintringham, speaking about ending repeat homelessness and homelessness for older people. Kate Colvin, who's a spokesperson for our National Everybody's Home campaign, speaking about ending rental stress, and Dr. Michael Fotheringham, who's the Managing Director at Ahuri Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, who will share his expertise about the evidence for ending homelessness. So I'm going to ask each panellist a question, and then when they've spoken, I'm going to open it up for you to put your questions forward. So if you put them in the chat, Kate Colvin, I think, is going to multitask and help us by trying to come up with questions that perhaps reflect a few of the ones that are in there. So I'm going to start with a woman who is sitting just beside me. Frances, the double whammy of domestic violence and family violence and poverty are the main drivers for homelessness for women and children in our country. And the previous government had a process to develop a national plan to end homelessness, to end violence against women and children. And in recent weeks, this government refreshed that plan. So is this plan going to fix homelessness for women, or are there some missing elements? Maybe tell us about the 3 big things that you think needed to be said in relation to the plan.
Thanks so much, Jenny. And it is a pleasure to be sitting here with Jenny. We're as close as the panel you'll get today with us in the same location. But I would actually like to thank everybody for dialing in the launch of National Homeless Week, and acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land upon which we're meeting here, and acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, as well as acknowledging any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be online with us today. So as we're all here, I kind of have this National Homeless Week, I do have a renewed optimism with the new government, a new ministerial appointment, and a forthcoming budget that we're all eagerly awaiting. And it takes place amidst a now widely accepted reality that Australia's housing system, regardless of tenure, location or circumstances, is beyond broken for an overwhelming number of people, and women and their children who are escaping violence are clearly a significant demographic in our homelessness statistics. So we already know that the data that reflects their lived reality. So the numbers that are repeated so often and that most of you probably dialing in are already aware of. We've had data that tells us that close to 8,000 women return to perpetrators every year because they have nowhere else to go. 9,000 becoming homeless after mustering the courage to leave violence. And roughly 40% of all persons accessing homeless services citing domestic or family violence as a co-presenting factor. Now, YWCA Canberra, as a specialist housing service across the country, these are not just numbers. They're our clients who face uncertainty and poverty, who are sleeping in cars or garages and who, in the face of overstretched services and an undersupply of public or social housing in an unaffordable landscape, face the reality of having to choose between homelessness and returning to a perpetrator. It never needed to be this way, however. So for too long, efforts to lift housing supply and improve access to availability of services has happened without an overarching strategic approach to address the crisis in housing and affordability more broadly. A national housing strategy that takes into account tenure, demand, vulnerable cohorts, geography, economy, and all of the government measures will contribute immensely to responding to this dire situation in a coordinated and effective way. So we all here today know that access to housing is fundamental in addressing homelessness. Along with everyone here, I welcome the Australian Government's Housing Future Fund initiative to set aside 4,000 homes for women escaping violence. And here in our own small way, YWCA Canberra, after more than 3 years, have finally been granted approval to build 9 homes for women experiencing homelessness or in housing crisis. So I want to talk about our modest development, because while Y Homes is modest, it will make a little dent in the undersupply of supported housing here in Canberra. But the impact on the lives of those future residents is going to be significant. But homelessness among women and children, and histories of domestic or family violence, is not just a symptom of the obvious housing pressures they encounter, but a government system that excludes, marginalises, and leaves women with limited pathways out of poverty. In going forward with the National Housing Strategy, we must also consider how the root and branch review of government systems and how they create or prolong poverty among single parents, around 70% of whom have experienced violence, need to be considered in a bold future housing strategy. Because for decades, punitive welfare and mutual obligation measures have made the lives of women who leave violence exceptionally hard. Many women leaving violence with children will find themselves not only at the mercy of low vacancy rates, stretched services, and exorbitant rents, but also the mercy of a welfare system that entrenches their poverty and sets them up for crisis beyond violence. Trying to survive, to find accommodation, while depending on the meagre job seeker or juggling the punitive obligations of Parents Next program is not policies that will remove anybody from crisis. A bold national housing strategy needs to consider well-being in all its forms. And while housing is a fundamental to improve life outcomes, so too is a livable welfare net that provides the means for survivors to begin building healthy and fulfilling lives. So my message this National Homeless Week is for government leaders, policymakers and advocates to work towards not only the outcome of safe housing for domestic violence survivors, but also a gender-informed, fairer and supportive welfare system that supports women and their families historically in their new lives free from violence. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Frances. And, the importance of, a housing outcome as part of the service offering can't be emphasised enough. Andrew Edgar, if you're there, can you please spotlight the speaker? We've got a rather beautiful camera. Thank you. Well, Kate Collins, that's better, but still, I'm still not quite where we wanted to get it to. So look, our next speaker is Catherine Robinson, and I saw her up there at the top of my screen in any case. So Catherine, Francis has talked about family violence, but it's also a big driver of homelessness for unaccompanied children and young people. The big changes that Francis has outlined enough, or do you think we need more to respond to the homelessness of unaccompanied children and young people?
Thank you, Jenny. And let me preface my comments by acknowledging that I'm speaking today from the lands of the Muanina people of beautiful Lutruwita, Tasmania. And Jenny, I'm just going to be really clear in answering that question. More is absolutely needed. And I think this because I know we are yet to fully consider the role of family violence and intimate partner violence as key drivers of homelessness for children and young people who experience homelessness alone without a parent or guardian. And whilst work is starting to emerge, looking at the impacts of violence in the lives of young homeless people, it's absolutely clear that children who experience unaccompanied homelessness are also experiencing intimate partner violence in their own relationships. And these are the violent, intimate relationships they're relying on in their exits from family homes. Family homes they're exiting due to the presence of family violence or the intimate partner violence of their caregivers. So we need to catch up with the reality of children's lives. They are not only experiencing the collateral damage of domestic violence in their family homes, but in seeking to flee such violence alone, they can enter into cycles of intimate partner violence of their own. The fact that we're so behind in our recognition of the unique pathways into and through homelessness for young people and for unaccompanied children in particular tells us that the development of any national plan to end homelessness must ensure the voices of unaccompanied children and young people are at the table. They can tell us what they need. Children enter into unaccompanied homelessness and into intimate partner violence when they're 12 and 13. These are our homeless youth and homeless women in the making. So both national domestic violence responses and homelessness responses need to recognise and engage with the brutal reality of such experiences and look to children and young people for guidance on the kinds of prevention and early intervention activity that can hold their voices, experiences, and their well-being at the centre. It's also absolutely clear that specialist homeless services are struggling to respond to the needs of unaccompanied children and of unaccompanied youth who present with more complex needs. And this again, to echo Francis's comments, is to recognise that housing is the crucial bedrock of responses to homelessness for many, but for others, developmentally appropriate and needs appropriate holistic care will also be needed. Nationally, our youth homelessness sector is not set up or indeed legally authorised to provide the level of care unaccompanied homeless children need. And remember, historically, under the SAP agreements, the youth SHS sector was set up to support young people of school leaving age to independence. Firstly, in the contemporary context, we need to make sure that calls for care and support provision until age 21 or older for those in out-of-home care are echoed and similarly delivered in the youth homelessness sector. As an unaccompanied child or young person, your developmental need is similar regardless of the system which recognises and responds to you. And we know that the goal of independence is harder to reach now than ever. And yet key mechanisms such as income support and access to social housing are more limited for younger people who are developmentally and economically more vulnerable. Again, these are issues which work against the current reality of children and young people's lives. Secondly, in states which do provide a specialist homeless service response to unaccompanied children, we salute you, because undoubtedly you are doing so without access to the kind of staffing and facilities needed to provide such care, and are struggling to bring together the diverse service elements needed to implement care, of which safe accommodation is just one. So a national plan to end homelessness for children and young people will not only have their voices front and centre, but it will reflect the cross-agency commitment needed to deliver family therapy and ideally reunification, school access and engagement, physical, dental, medical care, complex mental health care, including recovery from violence, trauma, and associated harmful coping mechanisms. This is about delivering a plan which acknowledges that the needs of children and young people are different, and that prevention, early intervention, and longer-term responses need to look different too. Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, Catherine, for sharing your expertise on the particular needs of unaccompanied youth and children. And if I can encourage people who are on this call to put your comments and your questions in the chat, because even if we don't get to them, they will be very, very helpful for us to understand what's on your minds. So our next speaker is Darren Smith from Aboriginal Housing Victoria. Darren, you know, it's pretty confronting when you think that Aboriginal Australians are 3% of the population, and yet they're more than a quarter of people coming to our homeless services day in and day out, grossly overrepresented amongst people without homes. What would you say are the big changes that are needed to end this overrepresentation and to better respond to homelessness amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities?
Thanks, Jenny. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country I'm on, the people of the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. As a Palawa man, I've grown up all my adult life on Wurundjeri country, so I'm very blessed to be here. I think, you know, the starting point for any discussion about Aboriginal homelessness is the crisis that it actually is, and what does it mean? There's a different scale to homelessness in the Aboriginal community, and it has, you know, slightly different origins. It comes from 200 years of dispossession and dislocation of Aboriginal people. 17% of Aboriginal Victorians access homelessness services every year. That's equivalent, if it was in the mainstream, that'd be equivalent to 1 million people a year. So my question is, why aren't we all outraged? Aboriginal Victorians access homelessness services at the highest rate of all states and territories in the country. And it's an issue of invisibility and overlooking. Aboriginal people have been overlooked and are invisible to the Commonwealth, and that's been how it's been for the last 20 years. We know that the homelessness system needs to do better for all homeless people, but Aboriginal Victorians have that different starting point. We know that roughly 70% of all people who come into contact with the homelessness service system still remain homeless. If they came in homeless, they still remain homeless after they leave. We absolutely need a housing and a homelessness system that houses Aboriginal people. And we know at the moment there's just not enough housing. In Victoria, there's currently over 3,000 Aboriginal priority applications on the Victorian Housing Register. We undertook some population projections that show that the Aboriginal housing need for social housing doubles over the next 20 years. So in Victoria in 20 years, in order to just stand still, we need an additional 5,000 social housing dwellings just for Aboriginal people. And with the housing markets at the moment not functioning, we know that unless we actually take some positive action, it's just going to get worse. The big housing bill and the Commonwealth election policy commitments are a great start to investing in social housing. But let's face it, social housing should be treated like critical social infrastructure. The next element that we really need is that we need appropriate support for Aboriginal clients of homelessness services. You know, we'd love it if there was a housing first approach taken and implemented in reality. The support packages for homeless to a home in Victoria are a great place to start, where they have dedicated support packages that are based on need. The support that Aboriginal homelessness clients needs to be provided needs to be targeted to the needs and the circumstances of individual Aboriginal people. We can talk about family violence, we can talk about people leaving corrections, young people leaving the out-of-home care system and juvenile justice, elders with chronic health conditions. Every single slice you take a look at it, Aboriginal people are overrepresented, and we need support packages that are targeted to their needs. And the support packages need to be available long enough to stabilise the person in their housing and prevent the next round of homelessness for that person. We also need a reformed homelessness system that gives priority to Aboriginal people, that doesn't turn Aboriginal people away at the first hurdle. We need a homelessness system that is culturally safe and culturally confident, that knows how to and can engage with Aboriginal people to understand their needs and their circumstances. Aboriginal Housing Victoria has worked on a blueprint for reform so that we can have an improved Aboriginal homelessness system, and stay tuned, we'll release it soon. The last thing I'd like to say is that the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, the next round of negotiations, we need to ensure that there is an Aboriginal schedule to each of those agreements, because we need to make sure that the investments are going into the housing and homelessness system for Aboriginal people. We think that a minimum target of all new investments should be applied of 10%, which reflects the level of overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in the homelessness system. Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, Darren, and thanks for giving us your expert view, particularly from the Victorian perspective, which to some extent all those issues can be applied across the country, and for inviting us to get in touch with our outbreak at the situation and the opportunities that the plan presents. Now we move to Kate Colvin, and Kate, tell us about the relationship of the high cost of housing to homelessness and what needs to happen to make housing more affordable.
Thanks, Jenny. And can I also start by acknowledging that I'm joining from Ngunnawal country and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. So look, the situation in the rental market is been getting so much tougher, and that's one of the biggest drivers of homelessness. So that's why it needs to be really front and centre and a really critical part of a national housing and homelessness plan. Just to give you an example of that, just in recent history, so we know that before COVID in 2019, of people receiving Commonwealth rent assistance, 40.5% of them were in rental stress. Now, when income support payments were increased and people got the coronavirus supplement and some people got JobKeeper, those numbers plummeted. So it went from 40.5% down to 29.4%. But then, of course, the government ended those payments and rent stress has now gone higher again. So it's now 45.7%. So the situation is worse than it was before COVID in terms of affordability in the rental market. But what that experience of COVID and the increase in income support payments showed us is that actually increasing people's income support has a material difference on the amount of rental stress that people are experiencing. And of course, rental stress puts people a hop, skip and a jump away from homelessness, because if you have so much of your income devoted to housing that you don't have enough left over, then any further shock to your income, a lost shift, an unexpected expense, can mean people can't keep up with the rent. And then, of course, homelessness can follow. So increasing income support needs to be a critical part of the plan. But another part of the plan needs to be about investing in social housing. And part of the reason for that is becoming more and more evident as we have lower and lower vacancy rates. So right now across the country, the vacancy rate is only 1.2%. And what that means, a sort of well-functioning rental market would have a vacancy rate around 3%. So what that means is that each time there's a rental property comes available, there's a lot more people competing for that rental property than there are, properties to go around. And so then two things happen, both of which have an impact on homelessness. One is that the competing tenants might bid up the cost of that rental, or the landlord might see the opportunity and say, well, if I've got 30 people applying for the property, I can increase the rent and I'll still get a tenant. So it pushes up price. But another factor is that it enables discrimination, because the landlord looks across those 30 and looks sometimes at 60 people applying for a rental and says, look, I've got 10 white professional couples. They're probably my best bet. That young person who's leaving out of home care, we won't choose that person. That Aboriginal family, we won't choose that person. And so the people who are most disadvantaged in the rental market, who suffer discrimination in other areas of their life, also then get squeezed out of the rental market because of this competition and because of racism and other forms of discrimination in the community. So that's where social housing can make a real difference, because it's housing that's targeted to people on lower incomes. It's not allocated to people on the basis of a landlord making a discriminatory decision. So it can make a real difference in terms of homelessness in that sense. But the other way that building more social housing can have an impact is it'll take the pressure out of the rental market. Now, it would only do that if we're building social housing at a sufficient scale. Building 100 properties in a big city like Melbourne is not going to take the general pressure out of the rental market. We need to be building a significant scale. And so that's why the Homelessness Australia plan, and likewise the Everybody's Home call to action, is for 25,000 rental properties a year, social housing properties a year. And over time, that is intended to address the shortfall of social housing, which nationally is at least 433,000, and it's going to build and become more like 730,000 properties by 2026. So social housing plays a really important path. Another important role for social housing, just particularly in relation to homelessness, is about the way the homelessness system functions. So one of the always persistent challenges in homelessness, of course, is that people come in through the door of homeless services and are supported into emergency accommodation. But without housing outcomes at the end of that emergency accommodation, it can quickly become that emergency accommodation becomes people's longer term housing option. And that's a really appalling outcome, and particularly as Catherine was talking about the impacts of homelessness and the impacts of violence on children, that, you know, having a child who's had a traumatic time coming into homelessness and then is either moving around or trapped in, you know, a tiny kind of place to live, perhaps without cooking facilities, perhaps in an environment where there's other people in the accommodation who are frightening or a risk to them. So that's another important role for social housing. So look, I probably will leave, but I'll just say one more thing, which just in terms of, you know, people's perception of, obviously there's a lot of people working in the homeless service system here, people's perception that it's getting harder, and it is getting harder, both in the rental market. I mean, we've seen rents go up 13% in the past year, but it's also getting harder in the getting people into social housing because we have less of it per head of population than we used to have. So a decade ago, there was 4.6% of all housing was social housing. Now it's down to 4.2%. And the reason for that is because government hasn't been investing enough. So in 2012-13, the federal government spent $2 billion a year on social and Indigenous housing. Next year, the previous government had budgeted to only spend $1.6 billion. Now, most of the decline in spending has actually been in Aboriginal, remote Indigenous housing, which is a travesty given the issues that Darren was talking to us about. But it's also been a decline in real terms in mainstream social housing, where the funding has basically remained flat at the same time as population has grown. So overall, the solution needs to be the federal government getting back in the business of building social housing, not in a small way. It's great that there's a commitment on the table, but in a very ambitious way to really deliver the housing, social housing that's needed, both to fix the rental system, make it function more effectively, but also directly to address homelessness.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for articulating the housing challenge so well, and also thanks, I think, on behalf of us all for our shared campaign, Everybody's Home, and the wonderful advocacy that it does. I'll now turn to Jane Barnes. Jane, I hope you're there. We know that there are a group of people who become trapped in homelessness and struggle to sustain housing. And some of the older people at Wintringham, that Wintringham supports, have been homeless on and off for most of their lives. So does a national plan need to address homelessness for people with more complex needs?
Yes, and I am here, Jenny. Thank you. And I'll just acknowledge that I'm joining you from Bunurong land in the Kulin Nations, and also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. But we know that people who have experienced repeat homelessness over a long term are highly vulnerable. We know that many will have experienced multiple traumatic events, and we know that they're far more likely to have a chronic illness or a disability. And whilst we know that this group is a minority of all of those that are experiencing homelessness, they are a really high user of services and tend to cycle in and out of services, insecure and unsafe accommodation and rough sleeping. They're likely to be disconnected from family and community, and may have over many years developed some coping mechanisms and behaviours that can be really difficult for services to respond to. So providing services to this group requires an active and persistent engagement, the flexible supports, and the plan's got to provide for this. Older people present very similar, but also some different challenges. This is partly because of the incidence of premature ageing and the resultant complexity of support and care needs in the areas physical, psychological, as well as social. It's also partly due to life experiences that have been endured over many years, and can often lead to an overwhelmingly strong need for people to be really independent. And they've a learned mistrust of services, and these present, very significant challenges. Supporting older people without a home, who have been without a home for a long term or on a recurring basis, it's a specialist skill, and it does require a specialist response. One that captures the persistent relationship and engagement skills that we see exemplified by our homelessness services, but together with the advocacy and systems navigational skills of workers who understand the aged care sector. So the plan needs to acknowledge these challenges and include strategies to address them. We need a plan that ditches the existing dominant commissioning framework for homelessness services. It's built on targets, throughput, length of stay, and it just doesn't allow for the flexibility that is required in support provision that is necessary to sustain housing. And as Kate just alluded to, much of it's crisis driven, and it's not tied to the provision of housing. So I strongly believe that any plan that seeks to end homelessness for older people and those with more complex needs must embed a housing first approach. Most people here, I'm sure, don't need to be convinced. We now hold substantial evidence that the right housing, with the right support, at the right time, it works. And whilst there may be different types of housing and more specialised supports required as people age, the basic underlying principles of housing first apply no matter how old you are. So I think we need to look to what we've learned from housing first to inform what's needed in the plan. What we now call Housing First was initially trialled in Australia as a response to rough sleeping in the Road to Home initiatives. And those of you in the audience that have been around as long as I have will remember those days. You know, programs like Street to Home were rolled out across the country, and they really quickly began to show that providing housing with flexible support works. And this was back sort of 2007, 2010. You know, since then, we've had multiple studies in myriads of locations, and they've all found pretty much the same thing, that over 85% of people in these sorts of programs retain their housing for more than 2 years, compared to 50% in other programs. Excuse me. Housing First programs have also been really clearly shown to reduce costs of people cycling in and out of homelessness and other acute services in health, the justice system and emergency services, just to name a few. I do just want to take a moment here though to acknowledge that there are a few organisations, including Winteringham, who I now work for, that have been doing Housing First for a very, very long time, long before it was rolled out as part of the Road Home. It just hasn't been called as such. And I think it is good now that we've got something to label what we've got so much evidence that works. I think the other thing to acknowledge is that there are some sectors, including the aged care sector, that have long recognised that the right support at the right time helps people to stay home longer. It's not rocket science, but it is time we embedded it in our homelessness response. The Housing First approach to end homelessness does have some core principles. Everyone has a right to a home. Assertive and flexible support for as long as it's needed. It needs to be client-centred, needs to enable choice and determination, and it needs to clearly separate housing support from tenancy management. And it's really important that these principles are embedded in the plan, but the strategies that we use to implement them, I think, can and should vary. You know, housing and accommodation types need to vary. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Giving people choice over where and how they live, whether it's a unit in the community, an apartment in the city, or some people who would like and who need a more congregate style of accommodation. They're all valid within a Housing First model. Support too has got to be flexible. Must vary about, in relation to individual needs. It's got to be flexible. And I think, as I think Catherine said earlier, it's got to include other sectors, health, NDIS, aged care, just to name a few. But the variations need to be driven by client need and not purchasing frameworks. Just finally, I just want to end with saying that and acknowledging that a number of governments across various jurisdictions have embraced Housing First, some with more attention to the fidelity of the model than others. I think our challenge in a national plan is to implement Housing First with sufficient fidelity to these principles, including committing government to policies that facilitate the required investment in housing supply, in cross-sector service collaboration as well as in our homelessness services. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks for sharing your expertise, and I'm glad you alluded to it before I did, but for your decades of commitment to these particularly hard to reach longer term people experiencing longer term homelessness, and that showed today. Our final presenter is Michael Fotheringham from Ahuri, and last but definitely not least, Michael, you've done a heap of work, you and your colleagues at Ahuri, on the evidence base around ending homelessness. Can you comment today on the ideas you're hearing and how they stack up against the evidence, and let us know if there are other critical inclusions that we should be thinking about for a national plan?
Thanks, Jen. And before I respond to that, I'll just acknowledge that I'm also joining from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Broadly, what we've heard from each of the other presenters today aligns with the evidence. I mean, the simple answer to your question is yes. What we've heard is evidence-based. We heard a number of facts and figures from the various other speakers, and I'm not going to go through point by point fact checking them, but broadly, everything we've heard is consistent with the evidence. And so I guess what I might just add to that then is some of the other research we've done at Ahuri in recent years has been looking at how the system operates. How does it work as a system? And first key point, I guess, is that we do not have a homelessness system across Australia. We have 8 separate systems in 8 separate jurisdictions, and then we have a funding system that operates between the federal government and the jurisdictions. So we really have 9 systems, not one system. The move towards a national housing and homelessness plan is a step towards having a more integrated and consistent system across the country. And we do know that the way funding decisions are made, the way flow of funds works between the Commonwealth and the states, and between the states and the services, absolutely influences the type of services that are offered, the service mix and the nature of the services. So we need to be really thoughtful about what that service looks like. So the opportunity over the next couple of months to shape that national plan is a really important one. It will have huge influence on what sort of system we develop over the coming years. Look, it is overdue. We've needed a plan for some time, so it's really pleasing to see that movement, and the evidence has again supported the need for that. Look, what we have had instead is a national housing and homelessness agreement for that flow of funds. It connects to state-based strategies, state and territory-based strategies, but really taking that next step and having an integrated system across levels of government, but also bringing in local government, bringing in the community sectors, bringing in industry is essential if we're going to resolve the sorts of problems we've been talking about today. So we're hearing some good signs from the direction they're heading. Some of the things we've seen in recent years have really highlighted service fragmentation, where services aren't integrated enough, and work we've done with youth, with families, with those escaping domestic violence, and with older Australians continues to highlight the need for service integration and a coordinated approach. You know, we hear about no wrong door approaches and a range of other names for service coordination, but ultimately, if we don't connect up the services, we don't have an efficient system. I was glad that Jane talked about Housing First. That is a principle that is well established internationally, and there's a ton of research from Australia as well looking at that and showing that as a principle or a foundation for our service system. I was really pleased to hear the Minister talk about buying a home, renting and putting a roof over their head, really thinking about multiple levels of the system. We're not just talking about a homelessness response. We're not just talking about a home ownership response. We're talking about the rental market as well. We need to look at all of those. And underpinning all of that, we have some really serious supply issues over the coming years. Kate and others have talked about the demand outpacing supply. We need to be building more housing. We need to be building more affordable housing and social housing. But the challenges we have right now, right at this point, around the supply chain of material goods needed to build housing is a really important consideration. The workforce needed to build those houses is another important consideration. Traditionally, we've relied on immigration to supply a lot of the semi-skilled and skilled labour used in residential construction. Constraints on immigration in recent years have really hampered that. So there's some really delicate balances to work through in that space right at this point. And I want to also mentioned the impact of environmental events. You know, the floods in northern New South Wales and Queensland, fires in multiple jurisdictions in recent years have withdrawn stock from the market in effect. And so that's just exacerbated the supply issues and the lack of connect between the supply and demand at the moment. So there's some real challenges there. I think there's also challenges about the nature of financialisation of housing, the way property investment is outpacing the need for shelter, and the consideration of how we balance those different needs for landlords and tenants is a really a growing concern, particularly in the short-term letting platforms, the online platforms and the like, that are taking stock out of the rental market into the holiday rental market. So there are lots of challenges to work through. So I guess, as I say, the opportunity now with a national plan to be developed and consulted on is really key. Really pleasing to see that dialogue between the Commonwealth and the states already starting with a housing ministers meeting, really really quick on the agenda with the new government. The range of measures that the federal government have talked about, the Housing Australia Future Fund, the regional first home buyer support scheme, the help to buy scheme, they're all good measures in their place. But again, the supply issue is going to underpin each of these, and we're not going to be able to address homelessness if we don't have a housing supply for people to move into. That's, you know, it's kind of obvious. I noticed there's a lot of comments and questions coming through on the chat, so I'll probably stop at that point rather than fill the rest of our time slot with observations. But Jenny, I'll hand back to you.
Oh, thank you, Michael. And, you know, we as a sector feel very fortunate to have under your leadership a Uru's interest in homelessness research and the partnership that we have in our national conference every couple of years. And just again, to let people know that if you haven't registered for the conference, there's still the opportunity to register to be there online next Monday through Wednesday when our national conference will take place in Canberra. And as Minister Collins said, she will be there to open it and deliver a lengthier address. I don't know how it could happen, but it's possible that one or more of our speakers might have just spoken for a little bit longer than their 6 minutes. And so we have run out of time for questions from the audience. But we have got your questions and your comments, and we will take them on board. So thank you, everyone. We are out of time. Thanks for turning up for Homelessness Week. I think we all want to be here together to embrace the opportunity that's presented by a government that does have an agenda in our space. And we would view this as the very start of our discussion about what should be in the National Homelessness Plan. And we hope the Minister will support us to be able to be out there and consulting with you extensively as the nuts and bolts of the plan are developed over the next year. So that we hope that there will be a great deal more to come. And thank you very much for your support today. Thanks particularly to Kate Coleman for her support in putting the event together today, and to Andrew and Edgar for rescuing us there in the background, and for YWCA ACT for hosting us here. See you soon. See you at the conference next week.